May 9th, 2025. The morning sun painted Joshua Tree National Park in golden hues as Joe Lil adjusted his signature black sunglasses and checked his worn leather wallet one more time. At 65, the burly veteran still moved with the confident stride of someone who had navigated both war zones and endless highways as a trucker. His bald head gleamed under the desert sun, and his thick mustache twitched slightly as he smiled at his granddaughter. "Grandpa Joe, can we see the big rocks again?" 5-year-old Emma tugged at his tattooed forearm, her tiny fingers tracing the faded eagle design he'd gotten after returning from service. "Course we can, little darling." Joe's gravelly voice carried the warmth reserved only for family. He lifted Emma onto his broad shoulders, her giggles echoing across the desert landscape. His daughter Sarah, 30, walked beside them, her camera capturing every moment of what had become their monthly tradition. The Joshua Tree Spring Festival was in full swing that weekend, drawing families from across Southern California to celebrate the desert's unique beauty. Food trucks lined the visitor center, the aroma of barbecue mixing with the crisp desert air. Exactly the kind of atmosphere Joe loved. He'd already planned their route, the Skull Rock Trail first, then lunch at his favorite spot overlooking the Mojave Desert. "Dad, you sure you don't want to take the easier trail today?" Sarah asked, noticing how Joe paused to catch his breath more frequently than usual. "Sarah, honey, I've been walking these trails since before you were born. Besides, Emma needs to see where Grandpa proposed to Grandma all those years ago." Joe's eyes softened behind his sunglasses as he remembered bringing his late wife here decades ago. The family had been coming to Joshua Tree every month for the past 3 years, ever since Joe's wife passed. It was his way of keeping traditions alive, of making sure Emma would have memories of adventure and family bonds. Sarah often worried about her father's health, but she couldn't deny how these trips brought light back to his eyes. At 11:47 a.m. they reached the fork in the trail near Skull Rock. Joe set Emma down and pulled out his old compass, a habit from his trucking days when GPS wasn't reliable in remote areas. "I'm gonna scout ahead real quick, make sure the path to our lunch spot is clear after last week's winds," Joe announced, adjusting his black Harley-Davidson cap. "You two stay here, take some pictures. I'll be back in 15 minutes, tops." Sarah watched her father's familiar silhouette disappear around a cluster of Joshua trees, his heavy boots leaving clear prints in the sandy soil. Emma was busy collecting interesting rocks, completely absorbed in her 5-year-old world of discovery. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried across the desert silence, but only the wind answered back. The festival sounds seemed distant now, almost mocking in their cheerfulness. Emma sensed the change in atmosphere and moved closer to her mother. "Where's Grandpa Joe, Mommy?" Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed her father's cell phone for the 7th time, hearing it go straight to voicemail. The desert that had always felt like home suddenly felt vast and threatening. She gathered Emma close and began walking in the direction Joe had gone, calling his name with increasing desperation. The trail ahead showed his boot prints clearly for about 50 yards, then seemed to vanish near a rocky outcropping. It was as if Joe Lil had simply walked into the desert air and disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of Emma's question hanging in the desert wind. The first 48 hours blurred together in a nightmare of search teams, helicopters, and questions Sarah couldn't answer. Park rangers combed every trail within a 5-mile radius, while volunteers from the Spring Festival joined the effort. Joe's distinctive appearance, the bald head, thick mustache, and tattooed arms, should have made him easy to spot, but the desert seemed to have swallowed him whole. Sarah barely slept, camping at the visitor center with Emma, who kept asking when Grandpa Joe would come back to finish their adventure. The little girl clutched Joe's spare sunglasses that he'd left in Sarah's backpack, refusing to let them go. Every few hours, Emma would walk to the window and scan the horizon, convinced she'd see her grandfather's familiar silhouette emerging from behind the Joshua trees. Ma'am, we've covered over 200 square miles, Ranger Martinez explained on day 3, his weathered face showing the strain of another fruitless search. Your father's an experienced hiker, and these trails, he knows them better than most of our staff. We've checked every cave, every wash, every possible shelter within reasonable walking distance. But Sarah knew something was wrong. Joe never broke promises, especially to Emma. He'd survived combat zones and decades on dangerous highways. The desert trails of Joshua Tree were his sanctuary, not his enemy. The man who could navigate cross-country routes without GPS wouldn't simply get lost on trails he'd walked hundreds of times. The media picked up the story by day 4. Veteran vanishes in Joshua Tree ran across local news stations, showing Joe's military photo alongside recent family pictures from their last barbecue. Sarah watched strangers speculate about her father's fate while she fielded calls from relatives and old trucking buddies offering help. The phone rang constantly, some offering genuine assistance, others just curious about the growing mystery. Joe's brother Mike drove down from Bakersfield, bringing Joe's favorite barbecue sauce and stories meant to keep hope alive. Remember when Joe got lost in that Nevada desert back in '98? Truck broke down, no cell service for 3 days. We found him calm as could be, said he was just taking a break from civilization. Had built himself a little shelter, was rationing his coffee like he was still in the service. But this felt different. Joe's wallet, keys and water bottle were found in Sarah's car. He'd only taken his compass and the clothes on his back. No experienced desert hiker would venture far without water, especially not Joe, who drilled desert survival into Sarah since childhood. "Desert don't forgive mistakes, honey," he'd always said. "Respect it, prepare for it, and it'll respect you back." Search and rescue teams brought in tracking dogs, but the scent trails led nowhere. The dogs would follow Joe's path to the same rocky outcropping where his footprints disappeared, then circle in confusion. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air at that exact spot. Local volunteers organized their own search parties. Fellow veterans from Joe's VFW post arrived with military precision, creating grid patterns and communication protocols. Old trucking friends brought CB radios and 4-wheel drives, covering areas the official teams couldn't reach. The community response overwhelmed Sarah, people who'd never met Joe but felt connected to his story. By day 6, the official search was scaled back. "We'll keep monitoring, but our active search phase is concluding," Ranger Martinez explained, his voice heavy with regret. "We've deployed every resource available. Sometimes the desert, sometimes it keeps its secrets." Sarah understood what he couldn't say directly. In the desert, after a week without water, searches often became recovery missions rather than rescue operations. That evening, Sarah sat in Joe's favorite recliner on his porch, Emma finally asleep in her lap after crying for her grandfather. The house still carried Joe's presence, motor oil and coffee scents, his reading glasses folded on yesterday's newspaper, his Harley-Davidson calendar marking their next planned trip to Joshua Tree. His motorcycle sat in the garage like a faithful dog waiting for its master's return. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly, friends offering meals, reporters requesting interviews, psychics claiming visions of Joe's location. She ignored them all, staring at the desert horizon where her father had vanished, wondering if she'd ever understand what happened in those crucial 15 minutes that changed everything. The silence felt heavier than any words could be, and the desert that had once felt like home now seemed like an adversary keeping her father's fate locked away. May 16th, 2025. 7 days after Joe Lill vanished into the desert air, a group of geology students from UC Riverside made a discovery that would transform the search from rescue to something far more sinister. Dr. Rebecca Chen led her undergraduate field study team through a remote section of Joshua Tree, nearly 2 miles from where Joe was last seen. The area was off the main tourist trails, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles and known primarily to researchers studying desert rock formations. The students were documenting mineral deposits when 20-year-old Marcus Rodriguez noticed something unusual near a cluster of barrel cacti. "Professor Chen, this doesn't look natural," Marcus called out, kneeling beside what appeared to be recently disturbed soil. The earth showed clear signs of digging, too precise and deliberate to be animal activity. Unlike the surrounding desert floor, this patch was darker, more compact, as if someone had carefully replaced dirt after excavating. Dr. Chen approached with scientific curiosity that quickly turned to concern. The disturbed area measured roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, and when she brushed away the surface layer with her geological tools, something leather emerged from the sandy soil. "Everyone step back," she instructed, her voice suddenly serious. What they'd uncovered wasn't a geological specimen. It was a pair of well-worn work boots, buried approximately 18 inches deep. The boots were distinctive, size 12 Timberland work boots, scuffed and weathered from years of use, with steel toes that caught the afternoon sunlight. Dr. Chen immediately contacted park authorities, while her students documented the scene with cameras and GPS coordinates. Within an hour, Ranger Martinez arrived with the county sheriff's department, and the area was cordoned off as a potential crime scene. Sarah received the call at 4:23 p.m. while she was preparing dinner that Joe would never eat. Her hands trembled as she listened to Ranger Martinez explain the discovery, her mind struggling to process the implications. Boots buried in soil meant human involvement. It meant someone had deliberately concealed evidence. Are they his boots?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd bought those exact Timberlands for Joe's birthday 2 years ago, had watched him lace them up hundreds of times for their desert adventures. "We'll need you to identify them officially. But, Mom, they match the description you provided. Same brand, same size, same wear patterns you described." The drive to the discovery site felt endless. Emma stayed with Uncle Mike, spared from witnessing what might be the first tangible evidence of her grandfather's fate. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them offering comfort. Why would someone bury Joe's boots? Where was the rest of his clothing? Where was Joe? At the scene, crime scene technicians worked methodically, photographing every angle, collecting soil samples, searching for additional evidence. The boots sat in an evidence bag, looking impossibly small and vulnerable. These leather companions that had carried Joe through decades of adventures, now silent witnesses to something terrible. Detective Laura Vasquez, a 20-year veteran of desert investigations, explained the preliminary findings. "The burial appears recent, consistent with your father's disappearance timeline. The soil disturbance patterns suggest someone with knowledge of desert conditions. They knew how to dig without leaving obvious surface traces." Sarah stared at the excavation site, trying to understand why someone would remove Joe's boots and bury them so far from where he'd vanished. The location required local knowledge. It wasn't somewhere a casual visitor would stumble upon. Someone familiar with Joshua Tree's remote areas had chosen this spot deliberately. "What does this mean for finding my father?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Detective Vasquez chose her words carefully. "It means we're no longer treating this as a missing person case. Someone removed your father's boots and concealed them. That suggests human involvement in his disappearance. We're treating this as a potential abduction, or worse." The word "worse" hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not from geological instability, but from the crushing realization that Joe hadn't simply gotten lost or suffered an accident. Someone had taken him, removed his boots, and buried the evidence in a remote location where it might never have been found. As the sun set over Joshua Tree, casting long shadows across the crime scene, Sarah realized their family's monthly tradition had become something else entirely, the beginning of a mystery that would either bring Joe home or destroy everything they'd built together. The desert that had once been their sanctuary now held secrets that might be too terrible to uncover. The boots that had walked countless miles with Joe now sat silent in an evidence bag, the first clue in a puzzle that would test everything Sarah believed about her father's disappearance. The discovery of Joe's buried boots transformed the investigation overnight. Detective Laura Vasquez assembled a task force that included FBI agents specializing in desert crimes, given the potential for interstate implications. The case that had begun as a missing hiker now carried the weight of possible abduction, and every detail of Joe's life came under scrutiny. Sarah found herself answering questions she'd never imagined. Did Joe have enemies? Financial troubles? Gambling debts? The investigators were thorough, professional, but their inquiries felt like violations of her father's memory. Joe Lill, the man who barbecued for neighborhood kids and never missed Emma's school plays, was being dissected like a criminal suspect. Your father's military service record shows he served in classified operations, Agent Patricia Morrison explained during their third interview. Sometimes past assignments create complications years later. Did he ever mention feeling watched or threatened? Sarah shook her head, frustrated by the implication. My dad drove trucks and grilled steaks. He wasn't living some spy thriller. His biggest worry was whether Emma would eat her vegetables. But the investigation revealed layers of Joe's life Sarah hadn't known existed. His trucking routes had taken him through border regions where smuggling was common. His military service included time in intelligence gathering. His regular visits to Joshua Tree followed patterns that could be interpreted as surveillance or meetings. The forensic analysis of the burial site yielded disturbing details. The boots had been removed carefully, suggesting someone with medical or mortuary knowledge. Soil analysis revealed traces of bleach, indicating an attempt to destroy DNA evidence. Most chilling, the depth and precision of the burial suggested the perpetrator had experienced concealing evidence. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, Detective Vasquez explained to Sarah. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. Someone planned this carefully. Meanwhile, the media attention intensified. Veterans' boots found buried in desert became national news, drawing amateur investigators and conspiracy theorists to Joshua Tree. Sarah received dozens of calls from people claiming to have seen Joe, each more outlandish than the last. A psychic from Nevada insisted Joe was being held in an underground bunker. A conspiracy blogger suggested government cover-ups related to Joe's military service. The most credible lead came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a housekeeper at a motel 30 miles from Joshua Tree, contacted police after seeing Joe's photo on the news. She remembered a guest from May 9th who'd paid cash for a room and left suddenly after receiving a phone call. He was nervous, kept looking out the window, Maria told Detective Vasquez. Had a big man with him, bald head, mustache-like in the picture. But this man seemed scared, not like someone on vacation. The motel's security cameras had been mysteriously malfunctioned that week, but Maria's description matched Joe perfectly. More importantly, she remembered the license plate of the vehicle they'd left in, a white pickup truck with Nevada plates. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus. Joe hadn't simply vanished during his hike. He'd been taken somewhere, possibly against his will, before his boots were buried as misdirection. The timeline suggested his disappearance was orchestrated, not spontaneous. Agent Morrison traced the Nevada plates to a rental company in Las Vegas, but the trail went cold. The truck had been rented with false identification and paid for with untraceable cash. Professional criminals had planned Joe's disappearance with military precision. Sarah struggled to reconcile these revelations with the grandfather who'd taught Emma to identify desert plants and always carried extra water for other hikers. The investigation painted Joe as someone with dangerous connections, but Sarah knew the man who'd cried at Emma's first steps and spent weekends building her a treehouse. There's something else, Detective Vasquez said during their latest meeting. We found evidence of surveillance equipment near your father's house. Someone had been watching him for weeks, possibly months before the disappearance. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. While she'd been planning family barbecues and Emma's birthday party, someone had been stalking her father, learning his routines, preparing for the moment they'd strike. The monthly trips to Joshua Tree, which Sarah had seen as healing family time, might have been opportunities for surveillance. "Why didn't he tell me?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than the detective. "Maybe he didn't know," Agent Morrison suggested. "Or maybe he was trying to protect you and Emma from whatever he'd gotten involved in." That evening, Sarah sat in Joe's garage, surrounded by his tools and motorcycle magazines, searching for clues the investigators might have missed. Emma played nearby with Joe's old compass, the same one he'd carried on their last trip together. The little girl had stopped asking when Grandpa Joe would come home, but she still set a place for him at dinner every night. Sarah found Joe's old military footlocker, something she'd never opened out of respect for his privacy. Inside were medals, photographs and letters that revealed a side of her father she'd never known. Among them was a recent letter, dated just 2 weeks before his disappearance, from someone signing only as Phoenix. The letter was brief but ominous. "Joe, they know about Tucson. Time to settle old debts. Meet me where we discussed. Come alone." Sarah's hands trembled as she realized her father had known something was coming. He'd walked into Joshua Tree that day not as an unsuspecting victim, but as someone keeping a dangerous appointment that would cost him everything. The letter signed Phoenix became the key that unlocked Joe Lill's disappearance. FBI analysts traced the paper and ink to a specific manufacturer, while handwriting experts compared it to military personnel records. Within 72 hours, they had identified Phoenix as Marcus Phoenix Rivera, Joe's former squadmate from their classified operations in the 1980s. Rivera had been living under an assumed identity in Nevada, running what appeared to be a legitimate security consulting business. But deeper investigation revealed connections to smuggling operations along the Mexican border, the same routes Joe had driven as a trucker for over 2 decades. Detective Vasquez and Agent Morrison confronted Rivera at his Las Vegas office on May 23rd. The man who answered the door bore little resemblance to the young soldier in Joe's military photographs. Years of desert sun and hard living had weathered his face, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him valuable in covert operations. "Joe Lill was my brother," Rivera said after waiving his right to an attorney. "We served together, bled together, kept each other's secrets for 40 years. But some secrets have expiration dates." Rivera's confession unraveled a complex web of past operations and present consequences. During their military service, Joe and Rivera had discovered evidence of weapons trafficking by their commanding officer. Instead of reporting it through official channels, they had confronted the officer directly, forcing him to cease operations, but keeping the evidence as insurance. "We were young, thought we were doing the right thing," Rivera explained. "The CO retired quietly, we finished our service, and everyone moved on. Except the weapons we'd helped intercept. They ended up in the wrong hands anyway, through different channels." Decades later, those weapons had been traced to several violent incidents across the Southwest. Federal investigators, working backwards through serial numbers and paper trails, had identified Joe and Rivera as potential witnesses or accomplices. The pressure was mounting, and Rivera had panicked. "I called Joe, told him they were closing in, said we needed to coordinate our stories, maybe disappear for a while until things cooled down. Joe refused, said he wouldn't run from his granddaughter, wouldn't abandon his family." The meeting at Joshua Tree was supposed to be a final attempt to convince Joe to flee. Rivera had brought associates, men with experience in making people disappear permanently. When Joe refused to leave with them, the situation escalated beyond Rivera's control. "I never wanted him hurt," Rivera insisted, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Joe was supposed to come with us willingly. When he refused, my associates, they made the decision for him." Agent Morrison pressed for details. Where was Joe now? Was he still alive? Rivera's silence stretched for long minutes before he finally spoke. "There's a ranch in Arizona near the Sonoran Desert. Private airstrip, off-grid compound. They took him there to convince him to cooperate. But Joe, stubborn as always, wouldn't break. The coordinates Rivera provided led to a remote facility 200 miles southeast of Phoenix. FBI tactical teams surrounded the compound at dawn on May 25th, expecting resistance, but finding only abandoned buildings and evidence of hasty evacuation. In a concrete structure behind the main house, they found Joe. He was alive, barely. 16 days of captivity had taken their toll. Dehydration, malnutrition, and untreated injuries from his initial resistance. But when the tactical medic called his name, Joe Lill opened his eyes and asked about Emma. Sarah received the call while making breakfast Emma wouldn't eat, the little girl having lost her appetite along with her grandfather. The words, "We found him," seemed impossible after weeks of buried boots and federal investigations. At the hospital in Phoenix, Sarah barely recognized the man in the bed. Joe had lost 30 pounds, his skin was paper-thin from dehydration, and his hands shook from trauma. But when Emma ran into the room calling Grandpa Joe, his eyes lit up with the same warmth that had made their Joshua Tree adventures magical. "I'm sorry, baby girl," Joe whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of silence. "Grandpa had to go away for a while, but I never stopped thinking about you." The reunion was bittersweet. Joe's physical recovery would take months, and the psychological trauma might never fully heal. The man who had fearlessly navigated war zones and desert highways now startled at unexpected sounds and insisted on checking locks multiple times each night. Rivera and his associates faced federal charges for kidnapping and conspiracy. The weapons trafficking investigation continued, but Joe's cooperation as a witness ensured he faced no charges for events that occurred decades before Emma was born. 3 months later, on a crisp August morning, Joe insisted on returning to Joshua Tree. Sarah was reluctant, but Joe needed to reclaim the place that had been stolen from their family. They took the same trail where he'd disappeared, but this time Joe carried a walking stick and Sarah never let him out of sight. At the spot where his footprints had vanished in May, Joe stopped and removed his new boots, identical Timberlands Sarah had bought to replace the ones buried as evidence. He placed them carefully on a flat rock and sat beside them. "Some places hold bad memories," he told Emma, who was collecting rocks nearby. "But we get to choose what memories we keep. This place gave me back to you, little darling. That's what I'll remember." Emma nodded solemnly, then placed her small hand in his weathered one. "Can we still come here, Grandpa Joe, for our adventures?" Joe looked at Sarah, then at the desert that had nearly claimed him, and smiled. "Every month, baby girl, every month." The boots that had been buried in deception now sat in the open desert air, no longer evidence of a crime, but symbols of survival, family, and the truth that had finally set them free.